Welcome to my presentation. This is a comparative analysis of the public policies on drug use and treatment in Portugal versus Vietnam. This presentation will run through 5 chapters. The first 4 chapters will explore public policy in Portugal and Vietnam respectively and the impacts each country experienced. The final chapter will be a brief comparison between the two. First, let's explore what Portugal's policy is on drug use, its strategies to treatment, and a brief history as to how the policy was developed. Portugal is known for decriminalizing the public and private use, acquisition, and possession of all illegal drugs. This was part of an overall strategy of decreasing social stigma to receiving help, with the objective of promoting recovery and harm reduction. There are 2 primary aspects of the Portuguese drug policy model. The first is the decriminalization of drug use, possession, and acquisition. This firmly solidified the opioid crisis as a matter of civil law and not of criminal law. The second aspect is the implementation of a system of commissions for the dissuasion of drug addiction. These commissions assessed and treated drug users. Early in Portuguese history, Portugal launched its branch of the war on drugs. At this time, Portugal's drug problem was not as significant as other EU countries. Despite this, Portugal launched policies in the 1980s that treated drug users with the same or similar protocol used to detain terrorists. Subsequently, penalties for drug use and possession were harsher. Police were given powers to enhance identification of drug users, and most importantly, all drug use, acquisition, and possession was criminalized. However, going into the 90s, a signature part of Portuguese societal reaction to the opioid crisis emerged and solidified. Society understood drug use to be a primarily medical problem. This is important as that shaped public policy in the 2000s. The state assumed a highly paternalistic role, implementing a medical aspect into legislation, but importantly, not yet letting off on the repressive and criminal part. In the late 90s, some problems emerged from this model. First and foremost, drug users experienced an intense double stigma from both a pathological and medical standpoint, and also through criminology. Moreover, society noted an increase in drug-related crimes and disproportional HIV contractions from needles. These concerns for high-risk users drove Portugal to develop its signature drug policy model in 2001. In 2001, all drugs were decriminalized, including the use, acquisition, and possession of drugs. As we explained earlier, there was a fundamental understanding that drug addictions were to be a medical and healthcare concern. So naturally, to avoid the double stigma, decriminalization was a logical step in the right direction based on the societal understanding of drug use at that time. But decriminalization was not the only thing Portugal did as part of its strategy. A major part of the drug policy model in Portugal is the featuring of healthcare in a highly active role. If you were caught with drugs, you were sent to the Commission for the Dissuasion of Drug Addiction to be given a civil penalty or treatment. These commissions were made up of district-level panels of legal, health, and social work professionals. These were people highly familiar with working with people suffering from an addiction and were best suited for providing a treatment plan. If you were identified to be a low-risk user, so an example of that would be a first-time referral, your case was to be suspended. If you were a moderate or high-risk user, the commission may refer you to non-mandatory treatment. Thus, healthcare supplemented the role of criminal intervention. Instead of being forced to present oneself in court, one had to present oneself in front of the commission. Then, while the treatment was rarely compulsory, the primary objective of the commission was to create plans that would encourage adherence to treatment. It was a highly healthcare-motivated system. It is important to note that in the late 2000s, the public policy was amended so that drugs were not fully decriminalized. For example, there is a certain threshold of drug possession that if you surpass, can lead to a criminal conviction. Drug trafficking is also illegal, targeting the supply of drugs. The maximum sentence for drug trafficking is 25 years, including aggravating factors. But what exactly did the commission do? Essentially, holistic reviews of the user's socio-economic life were conducted, so someone's access to education, economic security, etc. And then the commission would assign some kind of therapy or other treatment. Notably, this drug policy model does not have things like take-home naloxone, supervised consumption sites, heroin-assisted treatment, or medical or adult-use marijuana available. But were there any positive impacts to Portugal's drug policy? Analysts think yes, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. Firstly, the rate of opioid-related deaths plummeted after 2001 and remains far below the EU average. Firstly, in 2019, Portugal had a rate of 6 opioid-related deaths per million people. The EU average was 23.7 opioid-related deaths per million people, and in the same year, Scotland had a rate of 315. Another thing to look at is the number of opioid-related deaths. In 2019, Portugal had 72, Norway had 275, and in that same year, England had 2,685 deaths from drug misuse. However, in terms of all deaths from drug poisonings, England actually had 4,115. This is a graph of the drug deaths per 100,000 over the years between Portugal and the EU average. While drug rates rose significantly in 2001, we can see it fall substantially in the years after it, and it has never returned as close to the EU average. Interestingly, the highest number recorded was in 2021, which was 81 deaths that year for Portugal. One possible explanation, and indeed the one that rises to mind first, is that this number could have been influenced by COVID-19. With COVID-19 weakening public infrastructure, invariably the drug addiction treatment system enacted in the 2001 policy reforms would also have been impacted. This could have potentially influenced the care people got from the state, which might have led to an increase in deaths from drug use. Notably, even despite the rise, Portugal's number of drug-related deaths that year was still comfortably below EU average. Another thing to note, however, is that even before 2001, Portugal was already far below the EU average. This aligns with anecdotal evidence. Supposedly, Portugal did not feel the effects of the rising dominance of opioids during the original war on drugs campaigns. Perhaps because Portugal started below EU average, this statistic is less indicative of overwhelming success as it first seems. As we explained earlier, two primary concerns of Portuguese society were drug-related crime rates and HIV spread. For the latter, in 2001 and 2002, Portugal had over 50% of new HIV diagnoses attributed to injecting drug use in the EU. In 2019, it only had 1.68% of the EU total, a far better proportion. As for the former, in 2001, over 40% of the sentenced Portuguese prison population were held for drug offenses. That fell to 15.7% in 2019, below the European average of 18%. There may be an argument that because of decriminalization, naturally the number should fall. However, it still remains that other drug offenses like drug trafficking, racketeering, and possession, use, or acquisition of drugs above the threshold may also have decreased. While there is no data to prove in either direction, there is a possibility that the aforementioned offenses had an originally low proportion in comparison to general drug use, below the threshold, before 2001. Now, this is an interesting statistic. Portugal has generally had a higher ratio of high-risk opioid use at 5.2 per 1,000 of the adult population in 2015. And yet, this statistic has become largely irrelevant because of the low rates of drug use and drug-related deaths. However, it does give some insight into how Portugal managed to stay so low compared to the EU average. Because there is a high ratio of high-risk users to population, and yet low numbers of drug users and drug-related deaths, perhaps the population of Portugal is simply small in comparison, and thus the exact numbers being lower are of less importance. However, this is a speculative theory as to the relationship between Portugal's various statistics. Another interesting statistic is that the number of people encapsulated by Portugal's drug addiction treatment system also increased after the policy reforms. Before 2001, there was an average of 1.5 thousand cases per year. After 2001, there was an average of 4.7 thousand annual cases. This confirms that a significant expansion of existing infrastructure was a crucial part of Portugal's model. Chapter 3. We will now discuss Vietnam's drug policy and the results arising from it. Vietnam's drug policies are characterized by incarceration or detainment and the use of center-based compulsory treatment, CCT. Thus, those two characteristics make up the two primary aspects of Vietnam's drug policy model. First, Vietnam has a highly developed detainment system, wherein police forces are sent to identify drug use and trafficking throughout Vietnam with a no-tolerance policy. This is primarily a target on the supply of drugs, which has always been a core part of Vietnam's public policy. Those who are detained are sent to CCT centers, or which stands for The development of the modern system can be split into 3 time periods. The first is through the 1990s and the 2000s, and everything before that time. The second, between the late 2000s and into the late 2010s. And finally, many developments have been made within the 2020s. The fundamental societal understanding of drugs dating back to the beginnings of opioid dominance has been as a social evil. Drug use was understood to be the actions of fundamentally irresponsible people who were slaves of the drug. When the rise of HIV became a major concern, CCT centers were established first in the 1990s. In 2001, amphetamine-type stimulants, ATS, were recognized as a toxic narcotic substance for the first time, but there was a notable lack of guidance on how the state should regulate its rise. ATSs include meth, cocaine, and ecstasy, which all have very similar effects on the body. In the late 2000s, Vietnam began to move toward a harm reduction as a primary objective. Subsequently, they enacted policies that decriminalized drug use in 2009 and launched methadone maintenance therapy as the primary facet of Vietnam's drug addiction treatment program. People sent to CCT centers were to be treated with methadone maintenance therapy. By 2019, there were around 35,000 detainees in CCT centers, which is about 15% of the estimated 226,000 total users. An old belief started to gain even more traction, that effective treatment doesn't necessarily have to be consensual. Subsequently, if CCT centers were believed to be effective, the objective should be to increase the number encapsulated by the system as much as possible. In 2021, new policies were enacted to support drug use detection, including compulsory screening and treatment. In 2020, the number of new detained people who use drugs in CCT centers was 55,480. This is almost double the number recorded in 2018. But did Vietnam's policies work? Well, in 2000, there were roughly 100,000 estimated drug users in Vietnam. By 2018, that figure has essentially doubled to over 200,000. There are a couple factors to note, however. Firstly, Vietnam has a total population size 10 times the size of Portugal, being a little over 100 million compared to Portugal's 10 million and a half. Another thing to note is also that Vietnam was able to access opioids at a far cheaper price than Europe and the Americas. Subsequently, the prevalence of drugs in Vietnam, aka the starting point, you could say, is almost guaranteed to be inflated. So the numbers themselves can't really be compared as a method of measuring the success of policy. Just because Portugal has less users doesn't necessarily indicate anything about how successful their respective policies were. However, what can be compared are the overall trends. This graph makes the upward trend very clear, compared to Portugal's data, which indicated an immediate fall-off and then stable figures. One statistic that would be helpful would be the rate of drug users, so the number of drug users per a given population number. However, this data was not publicly available for Vietnam. Finally, we will note some key similarities and differences between Portugal and Vietnam's drug policies. There are 3 primary similarities. First, both countries implemented decriminalization laws. Clearly, drug use is a concern for civil law, so both countries agreed that it is unproductive to maintain drug use as a criminal offense. Decriminalization is part of a broader need to move toward harm reduction policies, which is another similarity between Portugal and Vietnam. The final similarity is a significant increase in capacity of the respective drug addiction treatment systems in both countries. Evidently, expanding infrastructure is an integral part of any public policy. There are 3 main differences as well. This is the first, which concerns the character of each policy. In Portugal, the idea was to rely on the holistic analysis of each person and create a special treatment plan based on that information. In Vietnam, the idea was to use a one-size-fits-all approach through methadone maintenance therapy. In addition, Portuguese policy never featured compulsory treatment, whereas Vietnam largely framed their strategy around involuntary care at CCT centers. Vietnam also experienced a significant discrepancy that Portugal did not between the purpose of the policies, which was harm reduction, and the objectives of police, detainment, and supply weakening. That could possibly be attributed to the second difference. A major factor that differed between the two countries was the pre-existing understanding of drug use. Portugal had long since maintained a paternalistic role when approaching drug addiction. Drug use was a medical issue. In Vietnam, the cultures of the society there maintained that drug use was a social evil and irresponsible. Of course, the implication is that it is a self-induced indicator of people who most people disapproved of. Finally, the third difference is an outcome. Portugal experienced a decline in drug use and opioid-related deaths that remains below the EU average. In Vietnam, the number of drug users rose. The data certainly indicated Portugal's policies were a net success, even if the data collected might have blown that success up a little. However, while the data for Vietnam cannot wholly said to be indicative of this, from what information is publicly available, it seems fair to conclude that Vietnam's policies were not successful. The general conclusion is that a difference in public policy can be responsible for a difference in drug use and public health. Depending on decisions made at the governmental level, many different things can arise. Portugal's lawmakers made the decision to create a system based on personalized information, whereas Vietnam's lawmakers decided to prioritize efficiency and created the system that took the most successful treatment and provided it to everyone. From these policies, a clear difference in drug use arose. However, outcomes are partly based on culture. Arguably, Portugal's paternalistic cultural understanding of drug users was arguably far more suited to harm reduction policies than the culture of Vietnam, which might have been more compatible with detainment policies. In any case, here is a link to my bibliography cited in MLA style. And thank you for listening to my presentation.